Hello, welcome to Merlins Miniatures. This is Project Baneblade video 2, where we take a 1999 Forge World Baneblade and restore it into a nice, modern, awesome looking machine on a nice scenic base. Now, we wanted this to be a collaboration with you guys from the start, and video 1 we said, what do you want this to look like paint scheme wise? And you decided Steel Legion was the winner. So that is what we're going to do. We're going to take this to an almost finished state. What do I mean by almost finished? Well, that's because we want you to decide how weathered, patinaed, battle damaged this is going to look, and I will tackle that in video 3. Now, comment below for whatever weathering you like, and let's get to the video. So to start this process off, I have watered down some of the airbrush primer that I used, and I use Vallejo's Mecha Primer, my favourite airbrush primer personally, and I'm just trying to get in all the little bits where I might have missed with the airbrush. So while that's drying, I'm going to use Eshin Grey from Games Workshop, and I'm going to airbrush this all over the tank. You may be thinking, what was the point of doing all the volumetrics? Well, because we didn't know we were doing Steel Legion when I did that. I will put the settings for the airbrush, if you're curious, over the screen, but this is just to save me time and get a nice even coverage. Back in with the tracks now, and I'm using Vallejo's chainmail, and I'm going to just overbrush this. Now, overbrushing, if you don't know, is essentially the same as dry brushing, but a much more wishy-washy, heavier version. You're not taking off as much paint, and you're not too concerned about just catching the edges. Yeah, overbrushing. Now, I did notice these awesome little skulls on the tracks. I'm just going to come in with Diorama and pick them out. The majority of them won't be seen because they'll be on the sort of base, but I'll know they're there. So Streak and Grime next for the tracks. Now, this is sort of a pre-thinned down. I probably added about 30% thinner to this, gave it a good shake, and I have this as a pot that's always pre-thinned, and I'm just going to apply it all over the tracks to make it look nice and grimy. If you're new here and want to see how Project Baneblade progresses, do subscribe, hit that bell so you are completely up to date for when that video drops. While that Streak and Grime is doing its thing, I'm just going to come back in with Administratum Grey and an airbrush, and I'm just going to subtly pick out some of these edges just to try and really define some of these panels, especially where it's grey. We need to try and add a few little bits of interest to really keep this model alive. One other thing I'm going to do is come in with my magic sea sponge. If you haven't seen any of my videos before, I love a sea sponge. They're very robust, can add some phenomenal textures, and are just a lot of fun to use. Now, I'm using a watered down version of the Administratum Grey, and I'm just going over those edges, and where it's slightly thinned down, this is basically going to, dry slightly transparent, and it's just going to look like sort of natural weathering, paint chipping, but also act as a highlight as well. So huge fan of the sea sponge. You can pick them up relatively cheap in a variety of shapes and sizes, and don't be afraid to start ripping the sea sponge apart just to, have a variety of sizes for different types of miniatures. A bigger one for your vehicles and terrain, smaller ones for your minis. So I'm now going to tackle the camo pattern, and I've used Wraithbone through an airbrush, taking advantage of that just to try and really help me get some decent lines. I started really thin, got a sort of rough pattern down, and then expanded. Mainly because I wasn't too sure how much I wanted to add or where I wanted to add it. But in the end, I'm really happy with how this turned out. On to some of the finer details now, and I've just again come in with the Vallejo chainmail, and I'm just picking out some of these silver bits, these cables and wires, etc. Any of the sort of skulls and aquillas, I've come back in with a Diorama. Again, these are just nice little pops of colour that will just separate it from being this cream and grey behemoth. A few small details like the cabling for the las cannons, I've just done them with grey cere and then just put on Imperial Fist Yellow. Nice and easy, nice and simple, pop of colour. I also started looking at the fact I've done my sponging, and I just thought I wanted to find some of these edges a bit more, so I came back in with that Administratum Grey, and I just did some rough edge highlighting and a few little scratchy areas. mainly just to really try and give some shape to something that is a lot of grey. So that's one thing I'm sort of really learning from doing this model, is how to make a grey interesting. After that, we're coming back in with the faithful sea sponges, and I'm going to use this just to add some light chipping and light weathering. Now I've used Rhinox hide and a little bit of black mixed in to try and darken it down a bit. You could just go with something a lot darker, but I wanted to try and find a tone that would work over the cream as well as the grey. One final thing I'm going to do, again, to really help try and sell the shape of all these interesting parts, is just a black panel liner. Now, you could use any black panel liner you like. I tend to always make my own because it's just very cost effective and I can control how much or how little I want it to move. So I'm just using a basic Winsor & Newton black oil and a little bit of mineral spirits and creating a nice wash. The reason that I've gone slightly thinner is because when this dries, I love the subtle sort of fade away that it does whenever I do any panel lining. And I'm not worried about it being perfect around every rivet and bolt. I'm just picking out a few and doing it quite rough. One thing I did notice when I was doing it is the black is a little bit stark against the cream. So I did add a small amount of brown to the mix just to try and make it look a little bit more natural against the chipping. One thing I also did was apply it very thick to the bottom of the tank where the tracks are and around some of the hatches. I did this deliberately because I wanted to add some nice streaks and sort of weathering patterns around where the tank would be lowest to the ground. I then come in with makeup sponge and just start wicking it away to create a nice streaky weathering pattern. So for all our searchlights and las cannons, etc., I just made a simple, essentially white panel liner. It's just a thinned down white oil that will just sit in those lights, ready for how we decide to do it in part 3. But it's a really bright base, so if we want some airbrushed OSL, it's ready and willing to go. Or if we're just going to paint over the top of it with some red contrast, who knows? TBC. One thing I wanted to add just before finishing this video, so I can nicely weather it in, or not weather it in, was to name this glorious vessel. And what better name than the wonderful wizard Merlin. And I'll be completely honest, I decided to tackle naming this just after I finished a flat white, so my hands are not as sturdy as they should have been. And with this beauty named, I'm going to leave it here, ready for part 3. Thank you very much for checking out this video, and hopefully we will see you on the next one.